And I swear, every time I start to get super active on YouTube again, I always feel like I need a haircut. Anyway, today my 5 o'clock shadow and I are going to be talking about our top tips for learning Korean. And no, this is not going to be one of those videos where I sit here and I tell you, set aside 20 minutes a day to review vocabulary. Consistency is key. No, I want to give you some real advice I wish I had coming into the Korean Language Institute here in Korea that I think would have really helped me take advantage of this educational opportunity a lot more than I'm doing. Quite frankly, my first tip is to be patient. According to one study done by linguists, someone like myself, a native English speaker who does not have a second language under his belt, it takes me around 5,000 hours of consistent full-time studying to become fluent in Korean. Yes. That's according to one study done by one linguist. There are a few other languages that fall under that category as well. I'll see if I can find it and put a link to that information in the description because it was interesting. We have it a little tougher because our brains are programmed into English. To people out there who already have a second language under their belt, they're going to be able to pick up vocabulary a lot faster than someone like myself. And to people who have another language other than a Romance language, they're already programmed to kind of play with grammar and vocabulary a little bit better than someone like me. So for us, who really only have one language under our belt, yeah, we've got to be patient. That also being the case, knowing this fact has really cut down on my frustration and stress a whole lot. When I see the other students picking up Korean so much faster than me, I used to get so frustrated by that. But then I realized they already speak multiple languages. Some of them already speak an Asian language, so their brain is already hardwired to pick up things like this. We just have to be patient with ourselves and not get frustrated. That leads me into my next piece of advice, and that is remembering we're thinking in our native language. We have to approach learning Korean in a totally different way. We need to be actively remembering this doesn't make sense in English because English is another language. This makes sense in Korean because it is the Korean language. That being said, try cutting back on correlations between your native language and Korean. For me, when I was studying and writing down correlations in English, it took me a lot longer to translate things in my mind because I was trying to equate them into things in English when in actuality, the nuance might be different. We might not have a perfect translation for such a thing in English. It really hindered my ability to truly understand the Korean language. The Korean language, by some linguists, is also said to be a language isolate. And while it does have a lot of influence from Chinese and Japanese, it's a totally separate entity in many ways, shapes, and forms. So really try to cut back on making connections between your native language and Korean. Approach Korean as a totally separate entity from scratch. It's not easy. It's not easy whatsoever, but try to make all of your connections to the Korean language through Korean. It's a challenge, but trust me, when you begin to do this, you will notice such a shift in your Korean ability. The other tip that I'm sure you already know, but to some of the beginners out there, I cannot stress this enough, drop the romanization of Korean immediately. In English, we do not have perfect ways to write out Korean pronunciation. And we're doing a disservice to ourselves by trying to approach Korean through our native language. Get on Hangul, the Korean alphabet, as soon as possible. My other tip to you is to learn the history of Hangul because it makes learning it a lot more fun. In fact, I actually think it will help you to learn the language because there's some history and science to it that makes it one of the easiest written languages to learn, according to linguists. My next tip ties right on in with learning Hangul, and that is to learn some history about Korea. So as mentioned before, the Korean language takes influence from Chinese and Japanese, and that's because those nations had actually occupied Korea for a certain extent of time in the far past. The other interesting thing about the Korean language is that Korea was actually a number of different nations. Because of the geography, because of those countries, and because of the nations that occupied Korea in the past, the dialects of Korean, as well as the Korean language, developed very, very, very interestingly. And I find that when you learn the history of the Korean language, you really learn and appreciate why this language came to be the way it is. Not only that, but it continues to be super motivating for me. My last bit of advice is to stay in tune with why you want to learn Korean. God only knows this is advice that I am preaching, but I have not been practicing. If you love Korean dramas, if you love K-pop, that's great. Find outlets through those interests to practice listening, practice speaking, and writing and reading. And make sure that you're reminding yourself of what your future goals are with the Korean language. Do you want to teach English in Korea? Do you want to go to college here in Korea? Do you maybe just want to have Korean friends that you can speak to in Korean? All totally great reasons to learn the language, but remind yourself of why you're learning Korean. Especially when you're studying at home or you're taking college courses that are outside of the country of Korea, it can be really hard to stay motivated. Trust me, I know. But reminding yourself of why you're learning Korean, that really does help. Anyway, those are my tips on studying Korean. I really hope that they are helpful to you, and I'm also listening to what advice you have for me. Lord only knows I need it. I'm in a slump right now when it comes to Korean. I'm definitely not feeling as motivated, hence why I'm making this video. Please let me know your advice for learning Korean or any other language in the comments below. And if you are not already, like and subscribe to this channel to support, and I will see you guys in my next video.